What's up everybody, this is Danny from Rogue Slate Films, and in between productions I like to mess about with things and tinker, and that's what today's video is about. We have our Mavic Air 2 and our PolarPro Variable ND 2 to 5 stop for the Mavic Air 2, and we're going to have a look at ND filters, talk about a little bit about what they do, have a look at this particular one, whether it's good or not, see what the quality is like, and some sample footage as well. So let's start the video. So one of the biggest decisions when you're looking into ND filters is whether you're going to get a variable ND or a regular ND. Now the difference between them is obviously the regular NDs are rated to a certain stop each. So basically you've got an ND4, ND8, ND16, ND32, and each time you want to change to a different one, you're going to need to land the drone and change the filter on the front. Whereas with the variable ND, we have all of those stops inbuilt into this one little filter, and you just simply turn the filter to the front of the filter and you line it up with the different stop markings on the side here, and that's how you basically change your stop. Now the biggest drawback with variable NDs is it's actually two polarizing filters that are facing each other, and when you twist the ring, it basically twists them together, so you can end up with an X pattern if you go too far, but luckily this has hard stops at the end, so you won't get that. Also, there's a possibility with some of them where you might have, if you're looking at a sky, for example, you might have a dark spot on one side or a bit of a colour cast or something like that. And something that I've found with this PolarPro filter is that you don't have that issue at all. It's very much just like using a regular ND filter. You don't get any of the drawbacks of using a variable ND at all. And that's a real sign of a high quality variable ND filter, because on a lot of the cheaper ones you will get that darker spot on the sky, so you don't get an even exposure, and it's a real giveaway that you're using a cheap filter basically. So if we look at the footage now, you'll be able to see what it looks like without a filter. So this is it without a filter at all, and you can see that everything's really overexposed. If we look here at the histogram, you can see everything's to the right, everything's really overexposed. You can see that the sky is blown out, there's probably all the highlights blown out as well. So let's put on the ND filter, the PolarPro 2 to 5 stop variable ND for the Mavic Air 2, and see how it looks. So this is the ND4. So you can see we're bringing down everything a little bit, but everything's still kind of overexposed. So this would be kind of useful for an overcast day, a very overcast day, and you just want to retain a bit of detail in the sky or something like that. Okay, so now this is the ND8. Everything's being brought down a little bit more. Things are kind of looking good. Maybe it's going to be a little bit clipped still, but we're definitely coming down. ND16, maybe we're starting to get a little bit dark here, but everything's kind of nicely exposed, and I think with a little bit of colour grading, considering we're shooting in D-Cine-alike anyway, so we have the most dynamic range to work with, I think everything should be nice there. It looks like we've still got nice shadows, not too noisy in the shadows, and we definitely have detail in the highlights. We're not clipped there, as you can see from the histogram. And then if we go to ND32, everything's very, very underexposed. Maybe there'll be a little bit of something that we can rescue from the shadows, and the highlights are very, very nice now. There's lots of detail in the cloud, but I think overall it's underexposed. But you can basically get an idea of what a variable ND filter can actually do, how it can help your exposure, how it can help you keep your cinematic settings, your 180 degree shutter rule. So basically everything here is shot 25 frames per second with a 50th of a second shutter speed. The other thing that's maybe a little bit fiddly is being able to twist the ring and dial in the exposure, but that's basically down to how small the lens is on the actual Mavic, and once you're used to it, it's very, very easy. And it comes with a nice little cleaning cloth as well, so if you do get a fingerprint on there, then that's no problem at all. So why would you want to use a filter like this? So To get cinematic settings, I say cinematic in air quotes because everybody's opinion differs on what's cinematic, but professionally you want to use a 180-degree shutter rule. And what that basically means is that your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So here in PAL regions, I'll be shooting at 25 frames per second or 50 frames per second for slow motion. So to maintain your 180-degree rule, you want to double your shutter speed to your frame rate. So if your frame rate is 25 or 50, your shutter speed needs to be 1/50th or 100th of a second. So that's why you really want to use an ND filter. You go outside, you have no ND filter, you set your frame rate to 25 frames per second, but then everything's horribly overexposed, there's no detail in the sky, everything's just washed out. So then you're going to start changing your shutter speed, and to be able to get a decent exposure, you're going to need to really send it really fast, which is going to result in a huge lack of motion blur. So instead of a nice motion blur like you would get if you're watching a movie, for example, you're going to end up with something really synthetic, and everything's kind of overly sharp and just it just won't look good. So that's why you want to use an ND filter. Now if you purchase the Flymore combo, you will have received a set of ND filters. Now the only problem with these in the Great British weather is that they are quite strong ND filters. We have ND16, ND64 and ND256. So out of these, the only one that I could reasonably expect to use on a normal day would be ND16. The other two are way too dark, and they would be kind of, if you're in the desert or a really nice sunny place, bright blue sky, midday, maybe then you would need one of those. So that's why I went with a variable ND filter, so that I have lots of options. So one thing that can be a little bit fiddly is changing the filter and removing the ring, the protective ring that's there standard. Now you can't really break this, it's very well made. So you basically want to firmly grab the camera in whichever orientation is easiest for you and twist counterclockwise, and the filter will just come off. And then to put it back on, you just line up, you'll have little teeth on the back of the filter, and you just line it up same way and then just twist it clockwise and it'll come back on, no problem. If you're like me, you might be a little apprehensive at first. This is my first drone and I was really worried about breaking the gimbal or breaking the camera somehow, but it's a really sturdy little thing. If you're confident enough to give it a little twist, you'll be all good to go. So one thing I wouldn't recommend is shooting the HDR mode with an ND filter, because basically the camera's going to take lots of different exposures and stitch them together, and the ND filter just kind of gets in the way of that, and it will make the auto settings on the camera increase the ISO to compensate for the ND filter, which will then in turn introduce lots of noise to the image, which you really don't want. So you might end up with a different image than you expect. It might be a bit mushy, a bit grainy, a bit washed out. So if you're shooting with the HDR mode, I would really recommend just shooting kind of high contrast times like sunset or something like that, and without an ND filter. Another great benefit of the filter is that it lets me keep my ISO at minimum, which is 100, which will keep noise to an absolute minimum and in turn give me the best picture quality possible. And that's what an ND filter is basically all about, is controlling your exposure just through the filter and the strength of the ND. So obviously the drone has a fixed aperture of f2.8, so we can't control the exposure using that. We have control of ISO, but once we start going off the base 100, we're going to start introducing noise, which will give us a suboptimal picture. So that leaves us with our shutter speed, and to be able to bring our shutter speed all the way down, maintain that 180-degree rule, we have our ND filter. Okay, so that's it for the video. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Keep an eye out on Rogue Slate Films for more drone videos coming soon, and check out all of our other videos too. And don't forget to like and subscribe.